Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for the second webinar in Sustainable Conservation's Spring 2026 Voices from the Field webinar series. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our webinar sponsors, Spotswood Estate Vineyard and Winery, Environmental Science Associates, and Holland and Knight for supporting our webinars and sharing sustainable conservation's vision of a climate resilient California. My name is Rochelle Young. I'm the Senior Director of the Water for the Future program. And for those of you who don't know us, Sustainable Conservation is an environmental nonprofit that is dedicated to the collaborative stewardship of California's land, air, and water for the benefit of people and nature. Throughout this webinar series, Sustainable Conservation and our partners will explore the collaborative strategies that strengthen watersheds and mitigate climate risk across California. So today, I'm honored to have as our panelists Glen Lowe, the co-founder and strategy lead at Earth Genome, and Jacob Byrne, the program manager of the multi-benefit land repurposing program at the California Department of Conservation. And these two are here to discuss their important work on water and climate resilience throughout the state. So welcome to you both, and thank you so much for being here. So today, to kick us off, I'd love for you to tell us a bit more about yourself, the work that you do, and on a broad level, what does climate resilience mean to you and in the context of your work? And Jacob, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. Real excited to see so many participants signing on to hear about this important topic. So, as Rochelle said, I work for the multi-benefit land repurposing program, which is run by the Department of Conservation. We help to support regional collaboratives, plan, develop, and implement land repurposing strategies through regional block grants that are located kind of on the coast and in the central portion of the state right now. So when we talk about land repurposing, we're talking about taking land that's in agricultural production right now and moving it to other uses that are going to provide different types of benefits across kind of a few different categories. We think of multi-benefits being things from economic well-being to habitat restoration or community well-being. So finding ways to repurpose existing agricultural lands to achieve those benefits with a real key focus on climate resilience. Because we are working throughout all these different areas of the state, climate resilience really means something different to each of our grantees. So I noticed one of our grantees is on this call coming from the coast, and on the coast, climate resilience to them means to prevent saltwater intrusion into their groundwater supply to maintain the quality of that groundwater supply. That's very different than in the Central Valley where we're talking about, overpumping of groundwater supply, constrained surface water resources, and more intense flooding all occurring within maybe the same area, maybe different areas. So climate resilience in those contexts looks very different to all those different folks, but we're trying to help these folks take a kind of regional approach to implementing projects and planning a vision for additional projects.
Thanks, Jacob. And Glenn?
Thanks, Rochelle, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. For those who have not seen the episode 1 with Josette and Carla and Virginia, that was a definite worth the watch. I'll try and be additive because I think this is such an important topic, and I'm excited to be paired with Jacob because these are two sides of the same coin. And so my name is Glenn. I work at the Earth Genome. We're a 501c3 nonprofit based here in California. We really work on issues of water, food, and climate, in particular related to environmental data and tools. So I spend a lot of my time working with data, building tools, working with local stakeholders. I'm just going to say for climate resilience that, we're in a very particular situation where we have a hotter, drier climate. How we balance the needs of farmers, industries, cities, the environment, tribal, so no one is left behind in California's future. That's what makes this all really hard. And so we all know the weather whiplash that we're experiencing here in the state, droughts and floods, that requires water supply reliability, operational flexibility, equity and ecosystem integrity. And And analyzing all those trade-offs is incredibly hard. And so we try and build tools that enable people to see those trade-offs, to do what if scenarios. If I take this action, what kind of effect would I have? And the trick to all that, of course, is you have to see a dynamic view of the whole system, what I call groundwater and surface water, quantity and quality, natural and built infrastructure within and across jurisdictions, assessing both demand and supply. So that's what makes this really hard, but it's all solvable. And so, for me, I'm an optimist that we can actually solve this. It's just we need the right tools and to get those into the hands of decision makers so they can make the best decisions that make the most sense for them. So,
Really great, Glenn. To this point that you're bringing up, Glenn, that augmenting water supplies and one of those tools being groundwater recharge and managing demands or land repurposing can be thought of as two sides of one coin, which is water resilience. So I'd love for the two of you to, maybe elaborate some more on how recharge and land repurposing are two really important tools in California's climate resilience toolkit and how they complement one another. Glenn, you can start us off.
great. Yeah. Well, one thing I'm just going to set as context. On Monday, PPIC put out this article that said the intense March heat led to snow melt, which was the equivalent of 5 million acre feet of water stored lost. So we're talking millions of acre feet that need to be replenished. And if you think about that compared to 2023 in our very wet year, where we replenish, according to DWR, around 5 million acre feet as well, 4.9. We're talking, we need recharge in the millions of acre feet. We need recharge at scale. And so I've just been really fortunate to work with sustainable conservation through the groundwater recharge assessment tool since 2016, where we've been working with local districts on this exact topic. What I will say, of course, is like you've hinted at, collaboration is so important in this space. And so we'd like to think of optimizing what's happening above ground with what's happening below ground. And I know Carla talked a little bit about the DWR watershed studies for the San Joaquin Basin, the 5 watersheds. And I think that's such a great example of trying to understand, if you go from a full headwaters to groundwaters integrated tool set, what is possible? Because we all know that for recharge, where matters greatly. Also, when happens matters greatly too. And so as we think about recharge, to quite simplify this, if anyone wants to land repurpose, we know that that land, if taken out of production, could be used for recharge. And so when we think about both things together, I think we get to better answers.
Yeah, that concept of when and where matters is so important in water supply and demand management. And I think this is something that is really emerging in the multi-benefit land repurposing space too. So Jacob, can you talk a bit about that and just broadly about how land repurposing and recharge complement each other?
Yeah. So, in the context of our program, I think of kind of a balance equation almost, or I think about groundwater sustainability in terms of balance with demand management being one side and supply management being kind of another, or supply increase and demand management kind of going hand in hand. And with the concept of land repurposing, those those tools really start to work together in a way that can kind of increase the impact of any individual project, because we're often taking um, existing agricultural activities that are creating demand, removing those, and instead, in a lot of cases, replacing them with recharge infrastructure. I think to Glenn's point, though, it is incredibly important to make sure that those things are happening in places where they're going to have the most effect, and also they're not going to cause unintended consequences. And so the way that we start to kind of balance all those different factors is by thinking of groundwater recharge and land repurposing generally as kind of a toolkit that our different grantees can use throughout their different regions. So to give you some examples of, I think, recharge recharge in particular and how that's being integrated into land repurposing toolkits. We've got a grantee right now over in East Turlock who saw an opportunity to do kind of take a really scalable approach to recharge. So rather than doing large recharge basins, they're looking at individual orchards. They're looking at the lowest production areas of those. Those tend to be swales, depressions. They're removing they're removing some of the orchard in those swales, so they're reducing the demand, the irrigation demand, and they're also building some small infrastructure to help them recharge in those areas, as well as doing habitat improvement activities too. So you've got this really small but scalable solution where they can do this multiple times in a single orchard and protect their overall agricultural activities. That's a very dispersed model. On the other hand, down in Kauai, those folks are opting for larger recharge efforts. They're taking out larger swales of orchard. They're integrating kind of community access and habitat restoration into those larger opportunities. So those two examples kind of exist they're using the same toolkit and they're applying those tools in different ways. And I think tools like Glen is referring to that really help these folks understand, maybe this location, this specific orchard might not be the best for a recharge, but it would be great for perhaps habitat restoration, or we've got great conditions over here for recharge. Let's really invest a little bit more at scale and do something a little bit larger. I think combining the tools to allow folks to make those informed decisions with all these different types of models really helps to give folks agency in creating solutions that work for their own locations.
Thanks, Jacob. Yeah, and I want to dig into this a little bit more because, it really occurs to me that the concept of multi-benefits and thinking about either land repurposing or recharge that can drive ecosystem benefits or improve drinking water benefits, that's a really great concept, but maybe really hard or opaque for a landowner to understand very well. And so I'm curious, like how do we kind of make that more accessible to landowners and to decision makers on how they can achieve these multiple benefits with either land repurposing or recharge. So if you can just kind of share a little bit more how each of you are working or how you've seen your grantees or partners working on equipping or empowering that decision making, that would be wonderful. And Jacob, we can start with you and then head to Glenn.
Oh, sure. I've seen some really cool from a technical side of things. I've seen some really interesting tools that help, just as Glenn was saying, that help to start doing this sort of what if scenario on a like a individual kind of landowner scale. So tools that will visualize, the recharge suitability of an area, that will visualize the availability of surface water or the potential for habitat connectiveness, where our grantees have been able to kind of sit down with a landowner and say, okay, where's your property? Let's find it on this map. Okay, you've got almonds in there right now. What are you interested in doing? Okay, you're open to habitat connectivity. Well, that's great because you're right by a creek or something, or the Fish and Wildlife Service has identified this as a great area for a migration corridor, and really visualizing that kind of those kind of possibilities is something that I don't think has been done before and helps folks to start seeing, oh, this is how my individual actions fit into this larger goal. Or, this whole toolkit's pretty overwhelming. There's so many options, but for me, groundwater recharge is going to be what I want to focus on, and it works for my area. So I think having that kind of crosswalk between the possibilities and those technical tools to visualize it has been hugely helpful for some of our grantees. And Glenn, I wonder if you've seen anything similar.
Yeah, Jacob, I couldn't agree more. These practical tools at the local level that put them in the context of decision that they're trying to make, that's exactly where we need to play because I think, well, first, just Risha, I love the framing around multi-benefit. Stephen Springhorn and the broader Sigmo team at DWR has just a terrific bulletin 118. If you haven't read it, that report that came out just a month or two ago is so terrific. It's all of this work on recharge is framed under multi-benefit and appropriately so. Jacob, to your comment, yes, this whole idea of trying to understand what the benefits could be in these what if scenarios specific to a particular field, to a particular farmer. Yeah, there are tools that we can produce that help them understand what the possible benefits are. I see there's a comment in the chat about unused basins, and of course this is what makes a little bit of recharge a little bit challenging, which is you just never know where and when that water will be. And so our ability to understand excess flows, 1 in 5 years, 1 in 7 years, where will it be, at what magnitudes and what volume, where could we direct that water? It's a complicated problem. And when we work with GSAs and districts, for example, in the DWR watershed studies I mentioned before, I think we worked with 30 plus GSAs in that 5 watershed study for the entire San Joaquin Basin. That's a lot of people. But ultimately, we want to get not just at the GSA level and help them make decisions very attuned to their local project and management actions, in their groundwater sustainability plans. But we want to allow farmers to opt in and make a decision that's unique for their farm. So if a farmer wants to do on-farm recharge, applying excess water on top of their croplands, or if they want to do in-lieu recharge, surface water instead of pumping groundwater, or to put a fallow and repurpose and put a basin, we want them to be able to see and compare and contrast those options, because depending on where you're at and depending on where you're located, and are you next to habitat, or are you next to groundwater dependent ecosystems or groundwater dependent wells for vulnerable communities, each time the decision might be a little bit different.
Great. Thank you both. Well, it sounds like, when we think broadly about kind of the enabling conditions that are required to advance these kinds of solutions, this is a really big piece, like thinking about the data and technical capabilities to advance these solutions. So, the way that you've described how we've been able to advance integrating data from different sources. This isn't just about water availability, but we're able to connect habitat connectivity and data from fish and wildlife and from other sources. That is definitely a huge advancement. Certainly, funding is a really big enabling condition too. And it occurs to me that the multi-benefit land repurposing program is such a unique state funding opportunity, and that a lot of state funding programs typically end up being for a single purpose, whether it's for water, for air quality, whatever it's for, and that it's really hard to kind of stack multiple benefits or incentives for a single project. And so that can really limit the project's complexity, also for permitting. And so, to me, the MLRP funding and this new tranche of Prop 4 funding really seems like a big opportunity in terms of kind of enabling conditions to advance these types of solutions. I'm curious, if you could maybe you want to touch on funding or just other barriers that might exist to further advance these solutions, or what's needed for us to scale. And we can start with Glenn.
Okay. Well, you're 100% right that funding, water rights permitting, there are some very practical issues that need to be addressed. And clearly DWR in support of Sigma has allowed and fostered a lot of that work. But yeah, I don't pretend to have an answer to what is, the funding needs and how do we get more funding. I'll defer to Jacob to talk a little bit more on the MLRP funding. I just will say that I see Kamiyar is on the webinar, and he's kind of famous for saying, well, the soft stuff is the hard stuff when it comes to recharge. And that saying has really resonated with me, because ultimately we need to enable people to make better decisions for them at the local level. And this question of telescoping data sets, getting to a local level, what's most actionable, we like to think and put things in terms of financial implications too. So within the groundwater recharge assessment tool, we like to do and enable GSAs and districts to do economic calculations too. So if we do this level of recharge with this portfolio of projects, some within the GSP, but some within individual farmers, let's all make decisions that have a great cost per acre foot type of benefit. And as well as where we can quantify the benefits for other things too, because we know that incentives matter, recharge crediting matters, accounting matters. Suscon or Genome is working with the California Water Data Consortium, EDF, ESA, and Olson on integrating the groundwater recharge assessment tool with a groundwater accounting platform and a groundwater model. So we know all these things need to connect. Like Carla said last time, we know we need groundwater at scale, and we need that dynamic view, kind of a whole system view.
Glenn, that's I like that framing of needing that dynamic view and that whole system view. And I think from like a my experience in kind of state government so far, Rochelle, I think it, taking that concept of needing that dynamic view and your concept of there being kind of a struggle with a lot of programs not necessarily not being able to take that dynamic whole systems view. They're more they've got a a lot of programs are mandated to accomplish like fairly narrow tasks, and that means that their funding has to be put towards those fairly narrow tasks. Um, and so I think in for my experience in the multi-benefit land repurposing program, that's created some challenges because taking a multi-benefit, more systems approach is a new way to approach individual grants, individual projects, and the program as a whole. And so because we're kind of approaching this from from this broader perspective, for us at least on our team, it's like the newness of the program is creates challenges and barriers at each step. And one place in particular where I think I see that is when you are trying to take this whole systems approach, you end up with these fairly complex projects that have a very long project pathway. So you've got to get buy-in from those local landowners, and we've talked about some ways where you can use kind of zoom those tools in and help those landowners. You've got to get their buy-ins. You then move to the grantee, and the grantee has to have a clear vision of how they're going to assist that landowner to get to that end goal. They might also have a board they need to get approvals from. If you're doing a multi-benefit project, you might have permits from the you might have permits from several different state agencies and local agencies that all need to come together at once, and kind of each of those steps along that pathway, each of those players kind of introduces new challenges, new barriers. And so for our program, I think that sort of like, while these projects that we end up moving through that process end up giving these really great multi-benefit outcomes that really expand the scope of what we thought was possible through an individual project. It takes a lot of steps to get there, and it's incumbent upon us then to identify where we hit those hitches along the road, help our other grantees to learn from that, so and expand that beyond our program, since our program is just going to be a drop in the bucket. I think at the with regard to funding at a statewide level, the California Natural Resource Agency is really focused on using Proposition 4 funding to start doing more of this type of multi-benefit approach, where they are trying to facilitate our application process, individual program application processes, to start cross-pollinating and make sure that if something doesn't fit in your program, can you bring in funding from another program? I think the Department of Water Resources is proposing some really exciting ways to do that with some of their Proposition 4 funding. And I know that's a goal for all of that funding. So I'm hoping that in the coming months, we'll see some integrative approaches and some novel approaches that help widen the scope of what the funding can do.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that. It's really interesting to hear how iterative this approach is becoming in terms of learning opportunities and seeing where the challenges are, for whether it's around kind of buy-in or project conceptualization and development, and that can be, can translate to feedback in how programs are developed. And Glenn, I think that, you've seen this too from the recharge side, is, kind of learning from, what some of the hiccups or barriers have been, and kind of establishing a community of practice that can learn from one another so that folks aren't recreating the wheel. And so I wonder if you each can share a little bit about how those networks are developing and how those lessons learned are being shared across different partners that are interested in these solutions. So Jacob, we'll start with you and then go to Glenn.
Yeah, that's something that's one of the most exciting parts of the MLRP program is this community of practice that we've been able to build. It's a pretty small cohort. We're excited to expand it with Proposition 4 funding. But what we have within our program, there are our regional grantees that are doing the work and implementing the projects and trying this stuff out. We have one other grantee that we refer to as a statewide support entity, and that's made up of a handful of folks. Sustainable conservation actually plays a great role within that statewide support entity, and their goal is to make sure that they're facilitating um, co-learning opportunities, creating a community of practice, so that when one grantee in Tulare is running into a problem, they can connect with the folks over in Madera because they've already figured out a solution, and they can start that cross-pollination. I think for our grantees, that's been incredibly helpful with monthly touch points, individual touch points on individual kind of projects, and site visits that kind of bring folks together both in person and virtually. And then we're also encouraging folks to think about replicability and scalability in the projects that they're doing from the perspective of, for instance, one of our grantees, I think it was Madera, put out a white paper for one of their projects that created kind of a transition between community housing and a orchard to just show, here's how we compensated the landowner. Here's how we ensured that there would be pollinator benefits as well as community benefits. So making sure we're putting out kind of those lessons learned and what tools they used that can then be accessed by both that community of practice within the program, but also the larger kind of community as a whole.
Rochelle, I love the question, and I see Jenny Marr is on the webinar. The Flood Marr Network is just an amazing community of practitioners, and for those who weren't there, back in November, there was the forum, a 2-day event. You can go to the website. SUSCON has a great summary of that event. It's a mix of just practical, tactical, here's what's happening, here's what works, here's what doesn't work, trying to eliminate the friction and having these kinds of projects be adopted. Everyone, of course, is heartened by the 1,500 projects, local project management actions in the GSB. Hopefully there's 1 million acre-feet of recharge at least specified in these GSPs. Now, do we have enough water for that? That's a question because, of course, we never know what our climate is going to give us. But that practice area, really evolved out of the Flood Marr, what we call the RAC, which was many, many years ago. A number of us were involved, 130 of us, all thinking about what are the research questions and practical questions and local questions that need to be addressed to make Marr, managed aquifer recharge, more scalable. And that really is the key, right? I often think about Jenny, and she keeps on pressing us to go fast. How do we get to scale? How do we be more practical? How do we get as many practical tools in the hands of local decision makers? And I think that's what it really revolves around, because ultimately it's farmers who need to make decisions. It's landowners, it's GSAs and districts. And I'll just add, we should have communities involved in those discussions too, because we all know that, even though California has, I think the number is like 515 aquifers in the state, each one is different, each one's unique. And so the people who are pulling water from all those different sources, we need to, again, see it from a whole system point of view. But yeah, if you were to ask me, I'm most optimistic about recharge because of this community that we've built, as exemplified by the Flood Marr Network.
Well, I think it has been so successful that there are other communities of practice being formed in similar ways as the Flood Marr Network. As an example, I think the Groundwater Demand Management Network is really trying to structure itself similarly to the Flood Marr Network. So I think that just really speaks to the success that group has had. And just broadly, that these communities of practice can really share lessons learned to make sure that they're not repeating common mistakes, or able to share, big points of success to what works really well. So we've touched on a number of different topics, kind of the data and technical side, some of the funding side, um, community practice. And, there may be other ways too that we need to be thoughtful about how we ensure the long-term viability of these programs, particularly after maybe state funding dries up. And so, of course, MLRP is a great opportunity. Landflex was a great opportunity. There's been a lot of money coming out from DWR's Flood Diversion and Recharge Enhancement Group for technical assistance. So, and then of course there's Prop 4 funding that's coming as well. But longer term, how do we ensure the viability of these programs, or are there other considerations that we haven't talked about yet? And Glenn, we can start with you.
Yeah, again, this financial viability, of course, is a huge question. And like you've both mentioned, Prop 4 with the drought resilience component is, I think, quite important too. I generally believe that the way to get more funding and more financing is to prove that we're creating real value from these projects. And I think a lot of measurement, a lot of quantifying the benefits just helps make the case. I've always felt like, sure, we should always be tracking the amount of recharge in acre feet per year. DWR, PPIC, a number of folks are doing that on a yearly basis. But the more we can also substantiate the benefits we're having for local communities, number of wells that were not dewatered, the number of flood days that were reduced versus previous or likely, the return of recharge water to the stream during dry and critical years. So there's just a lot of quantifiable benefits that frankly, we try to look at as part of the DWR San Joaquin Basin watershed studies. There's I think 8 million data points on that dashboard that DWR put out describing the results of that study. And we try to quantify where we could, but I generally believe, yeah, show more results and that will justify and help ensure future funding despite the obvious uncertainty of the California state budget.
And Jacob, any other, thoughts on how we could ensure the long-term viability of these programs?
Yeah, I really agree, Glenn, with your focus on showing results and making sure that you're clearly tying those results to the previous investments that have made. A lot of my work before moving into the multi-benefit land repurposing program was with wildfire resilience, and they're asking the same questions in that space too. Of we've got, I think in both spaces, we know we've got these large challenges that are going to stick with us, that are going to require continued investment. And I think in both cases, we're seeing that when you can show results that really helps drive continued investment. I think that's also as the need for one thing where maybe that wildfire space is a little bit ahead or has moved a little further is where we obviously see that need is so visceral and it's so understood. It's so understood that I think folks have been really focusing on creative financing mechanisms of really looking beyond that governmental incentive, and how do we privately finance and come up with financing mechanisms that can also be investment mechanisms for wildfire resilience. And they're really effectively moving that ahead. I think it's potentially a little farther ahead in conversations in the groundwater space, but I can see. I think the groundwater space is moving that direction as GSAs are adapting to restrictions. I think it's forcing them to look into these different financing mechanisms, these different ways to value these resources that are being protected through these different projects.
Great.
Rochelle, I'm just going to build real quick on what Jacob said, because I love what he just said. There are these highly related cascading hazards, whether it be droughts or floods or fires. We all know that these issues also with conservation and biodiversity, they're all related. I think the more we can pool that money and ensure the multi-benefit, I think it'll just, when you get $3 of benefit for $1 of investment, and it touches and benefits so many people, including the vulnerable and tribal and the environment, it just makes the case that much more compelling.
Well, thank you both. I mean, I think, this point of measuring results, and then also doing the communications and storytelling are so important and often a piece that gets left out because many of us in the water space are engineers or hydrogeologists, and we don't think about the soft stuff very much and the importance of storytelling and communications, but those can be such powerful pieces in communicating value and building trust as well. So I appreciate that you both, touched on how important that can be in the longevity of these programs. So what else are we missing from this conversation? What else is important for water sustainability and climate resilience in California? So Glenn, I'll start with you.
Yeah, and this will build on what I just said about drought and cascading hazards. For the last few years, I've been really fortunate to work with DWR on the DRIP Collaborative, which is essentially the state's drought task force. And this droughts and floods, there are two ends of the extreme, but yet when done correctly, they can be essentially a mutual solution. And so I kind of consider it the gamey of extremes, right? Take these excess flows, put them back into the ground. So when it is a dry critical year, we can, tap that as a resilience source, if you will. And so our ability to see across those extremes, I think, is incredibly important. Again, if you look at the long-term horizon, whether it's Sigma, 20-year horizons or watershed studies, which we really looked at a whole host of time horizons out into 100 plus years, we really need to think about if that flood happens 1 in 5 years, 1 in 7 years, how do we get as much of that water back into the ground? And so when Carla mentioned in episode 1 of this series that, she often gets called by the governor's office, how much of that water did we get back in the ground? That's the kind of question we need to be asking ourselves. And when we think about, pairing that with DRIP and what you just said, Rochelle, about communication and impact metrics, I just want to emphasize how important that is. I think people take action when they understand the situation, and they'll continue to take even more action when they can see the benefit. And so even in the drought task force for this year, we're working a lot on drought indicators and metrics, which of course ties to this because you want to have those realization, am I at risk? Am I vulnerable? What's my exposure? But you'd also want to know the impact. And so as we think about, and if you look just back at the last 5, 10 years, how recharge has grown, it's exactly what you see. You see the dry years followed by one of the wettest years on record. And those kinds of extremes we've got to take advantage of.
Glenn, that's a great framing. Yeah, I've been thinking about the same concepts. I've never been able to kind of articulate it quite like that. I love thinking about that in terms of extremes of impact. And I think what comes to mind for me in thinking about what we haven't touched on yet, or what's often missing in this conversation, is again thinking about extremes or different sides of the spectrum. But in our case, my experience has frequently been with thinking about different sides of I guess scale of projects, of landowners, of solutions. So I think a lot of the focus I've seen is on large projects that are if that are being put forward by either state organizations, large collaborations, large landowners. And what I keep hearing from our grantees is kind of a missing focus on those smaller solutions. Like the small landowners kind of being left out. It's, they're worried, will I have to do CEQA for a recharge project? Will I have to do permitting? Do I have to talk to the Department of Fish and Wildlife? All those things, if, for these small farmers those are just kind of a bridge. Each one of those is a bridge too far almost. So I think there's space for us to really focus in on how can we bring along those small landowners to make sure that they're not being left out, make sure that because they're feeling the pressure of these extremes just the same as the large landowners are. They just have less resources to deal with them. So I think going forward with our program in particular, we really want to focus on how we bring forward those small and medium landowners to make sure that they're not being left out of the solution, because they can be part of that solution. And that example in East Turlock I shared earlier of these really small, scalable types of approaches, that's the kind of thing that can really get buy-in on that small local level and really build you up to larger impacts across landscapes.
It's a really powerful reflection, Jacob, just thinking about, how to make these programs more accessible to the small landowners too. So, be really interested to hear about how those considerations get integrated into the future. So I want to just note for the audience, I've got a couple more questions for our panelists. I see a couple from the audience in our Q&A box, but if you would like to ask the panelists a question, please add to that Q&A box so that we can see those and address those, and we'll get to those shortly. So, there's a really, I've always loved that saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And certainly our experience at Sustainable Conservation has been that no single party can achieve systems level change, which is really required when we're talking about these kinds of challenges of climate and water resilience, and that it requires coordination and collaboration across sectors. So I'd love to hear from you about your experience with coordination and collaboration and how that's played a role in your work. Jacob, let's start with you.
Yeah, sure. So collaboration is written into the DNA of a multi-benefit land repurposing program. So I've mentioned a couple times we operate on a block grant format. And what that means is that we're giving kind of larger grants to entities working at a regional scale. So maybe you can imagine maybe a county scale or a sub-basin. But each of those grants has a lead grantee, and those lead grantees are required to work within a collaboration, in a partnership. So each of our grants is administered by folks, they'll all include a GSA member, but they'll also include community groups, community landowner groups or farmer groups, community voices, and specialists as well. And so from the very beginning of the program, from the foundation, the people who are doing the work, there's a collaboration that's driving the work. In addition, each step along the way, when we're asking them to plan projects and strategies, when we're asking them to develop projects and implement projects, we're also pushing those folks to collaborate across different groups. So again, making sure that when you are selecting projects, you've heard from the priorities of community residents, farm workers, growers, what the GSA wants, and you're balancing all of those things so that at the end of the day, the projects that we're putting forward through the MLRP program reflect a broad-based level of support. And what that allows you to do is find really unique ways to add value to different projects. For instance, we've got a really successful upland habitat restoration project down in the Tulare Basin, where one of the community organization partner there decided this is a great opportunity for us to bring our high school in to do a statewide, to enter the science fair, do some on-the-ground research about what this land repurposing looks like. And they ended up getting second place in the statewide science fair. And that's something that you never would have known that these high schoolers could take this project and do so much with it if you didn't have those folks in the room collaborating from the outset of the project. And so, yeah, collaboration is just so key to us. It's in the DNA of what this program does, but also really key to what the department tries to achieve as well.
That's a great story. Glenn?
To get to collaboration and coordination, you need connection. And, I've been so fortunate to work with Sustainable Conservation for the last 10 years on grant, but you could argue that that's not the most important collaboration. It's what's the most important is with the local districts, with the GSAs, because they're ultimately the ones who do the projects on the ground, the local folks. And so whether it's working across multiple GSAs in Merced, working across multiple GSAs in Turlock, those projects we've worked on through the last several years and continue to work on and beginning work now in YOLO as well, like ultimately it all comes down to allowing people to make better decisions that make local sense for them and acknowledging the fact that sometimes the people who have the water for recharge aren't necessarily the people who have the land or who have the conveyance or who has the projects. So the ability to have coordination, new to world projects that wouldn't have happened without this kind of conversation, because yeah, the only way to build connection is through conversation. And so we really like to think that where, we build tools, but where tools stop, human beings begin. It ultimately all comes down to human beings taking action at the local level that make the most sense for them. So I could go on and on, but this really is the crux of it. To scale recharge to the extent we need more people making decisions that make sense for them.
Great. Well, this is my last question, and then we'll get to audience Q&A. What is one takeaway that you want the audience to remember from this conversation? Glenn, we'll start with you.
We've made incredible progress. For those, I know so many, I recognize so many names of people on the webinar. This community has just done tremendous things. And out of curiosity, I looked at the 2016 Bulletin 118, the groundwater report California puts out, DWR puts out. And in that report, there were 4 mentions of recharge in 2016. Then I looked at the 2020 report, then there were 10 mentions of recharge if you find in the report. In the just released 2025 report, there are 121 mentions of recharge, right? That's the level of awareness, of education, of importance that this has received over the years. And, I could go on and on about the different Senate bills, 122, 659, 72, that, made aquifers natural infrastructure, then really led to all this work on basin characterization, aquifer recharge potential mapping. So there's just so much happening now that it just wasn't true 10 years ago. And so I'd like to think that the next 10 years will continue to grow, hopefully even exponentially, because now we understand the blocking and tackling of recharge. But we still, there are still obstacles out there, like getting the permitting. And I know there's a lot of streamlining, making sure we really take advantage of when we do have those wet years. I'd be amiss if I didn't mention water quality. You have to be really thoughtful where you do recharge to ensure water quality is not hurt, especially for vulnerable communities. So there's more work to be done, but I think we have so much momentum. And so for me, that's the big takeaway, a little bit of optimism and hope.
That's great, Glenn. I really agree with that, with that sentiment. And if you don't mind, I'm going to steal another sentiment that you mentioned earlier in this panel as well, which is you and Rochelle really both touched on the fact that there isn't necessarily one solution that's going to get us to where we want to be. This I think there is reason for optimism. There is reason for hope because folks are finding these different solutions that are working in all the different. All the different contexts we see. This is a generational issue that we're dealing with, a statewide issue that we're dealing with, and that really means that one solution isn't going to do it. It's going to take every great idea coming together, implementing them, together, implementing them at various scales, implementing them in the context of these different extremes that we're now facing as well. So just keep it in mind. I think that that integrative approach and understanding that one solution isn't going to solve all of our problems, but that as Glenn said, we should have hope because those solutions are coming fast and furious, and we're finding new ways to improve them.
Really wonderful. And I loved the particular data points, Glenn, of how often recharge was mentioned. Certainly, you're right, Jacob. Like this is not there's no single solution that's going to solve California's climate or water challenges. And certainly that's why we have both of you on today to kind of talk to a couple of the different approaches to achieve water resilience. And, it occurs to me too, Glenn, with your data points of how often recharge was mentioned, that, recharge is really taking off and has now become quite mainstream, whereas demand management and land repurposing strategies are really emerging now at the local level. And so hopefully there can be those lessons learned from, how did we get recharge to be the successful practice that it is today? And how can we take those transferable lessons to the demand management space as well? So Glenn, you touched on this question that's kind of coming from an audience member. So I'm going to take this question. So recently, California recognized aquifers as natural infrastructure. How do you think this can help advance multi-benefit recharge, direct public funding, and streamline project permitting to replenish and remediate degraded aquifers?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I wish I could ask Kamiar his opinion on this question because he would have a very well-informed opinion. So he's referencing SB 122, which in 2023 recognized aquifers as natural infrastructure, and I think this is such an important point because we didn't talk that much about the combination of FARO, the forecast-informed reservoir operations, plus MAR, and this whole concept of operating our built infrastructure consistent with downstream or upstream natural infrastructure is an incredibly important idea. We can release water at certain times that could then be recharged. And there's a lot of really complicated math that Dita, our team, did for this on the watershed studies. But this to me is that broader watershed to aquifer optimization, right? You need the whole tool set to be able to understand the optimization that's possible. This really builds on some other work we did or Genome did outside of California, which was funded by the National Science Foundation, where we very much looked at this pairing of green infrastructure with gray infrastructure, and could you operate them in different ways? We were looking at wetlands in this example in Texas. So to me, it is part and parcel of that whole system dynamic view. You got to optimize all assets together because we often operate those assets in silos. Flood infrastructure versus water supply infrastructure. So it's only when we look across the entire system we'll see these kinds of opportunities.
Do you want to build on that at all, Jacob?
Yeah, just briefly, Glenn, yeah, I completely agree with the points that you just made, and I'll just take it maybe one more step back of thinking, one more step back towards and even broadening that system as a whole. I think recognizing aquifers as an infrastructure is a great step forward. I've also recently been hearing discussions from folks who are thinking about kind of headwaters and the health of forests in those headwaters as part of this interconnected watershed view of water sustainability within the state. So thinking about, I think aquifers are an excellent first step. I would be really interested in continuing this multi-benefit kind of perspective. How do we think about all the way from snowpack all the way down to the end user? How do we integrate that and look at that as a chain of opportunities for natural infrastructure? I think folks are starting to have those conversations, but I think it's at the introduction stage right now of folks from, for instance, LA Metro coming up to areas in the Sierras to learn about forest health practices and how those are helping to increase water availability. So it's really at the beginning stages, but I'm really hoping to that in 5 or 10 years, those conversations will have really moved forward appreciably to those whole systems perspectives.
Excellent. Another question, and I think you can both speak to this, is what role what role do you see for highly distributed recharge or even land repurposing at the parcel scale? A lot of these solutions are done at the highly localized level. So there were some examples, but such as bioswales, rain gardens, curb extensions, permeable pavement. And of course, there are a lot of examples both in the recharge and the land repurposing space. And so what do we know about efficacy and what tools can help us make those decisions?
I haven't worked as much with this. I don't know, Jacob, did you want to?
Yeah, I unfortunately have a background in environmental analysis in the CEQA space. So I'm like I've worked a lot with things like are being mentioned, like rain gardens, curb extensions, permeable pavement. I think although I'm much happier in the space that we are now because it's a lot more innovative. I do think that's part of the solution. I think what I saw, as I was an environmental consultant, I think similarly, there's folks who are taking really innovative approaches to designing urban spaces that see those urban spaces in the context of green infrastructure, like you were talking about, Glenn. And I think there is a through line there of understanding how effective those urban solutions are. Um, and but also balancing that with what types of risks that those can pose for things like water quality and community water supplies. So I think there is room for those solutions at those varying scales. But I do think that we need a lot more work there to understand what role they can effectively play. Yeah, I don't know. Just because I haven't seen the data, I'm not sure if that's necessarily out there quite yet.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add to that too is that to both of your points on building tool sets, there is a spatial and dynamic role that each piece of land can play in achieving water sustainability and quantifying the impacts both from kind of the quantity side, but also a quality or a habitat conservation side. And so are many dimensions for us to be thinking about how a single piece of land can have impact in the climate resilience space. So this is definitely a space that I think our community of practice is growing in building those quantifiable toolkits for evaluating those opportunities, both at the urban level and also at the rural and agricultural levels as well. Um, so we are, I think, at time here, which is too bad because we have so many other good questions in our audience Q&A. So I apologize for kind of monopolizing our time here. So I think what I'm going to do here is wrap us up. I want to first thank our panelists so much for the opportunity of being here today and talking with us. Um, I I really appreciate you sharing your expertise, and I want to thank everybody, all of our audience members, for tuning in today. We hope that you enjoyed the conversation. We'll be sending the recording soon in case you missed anything or would like to revisit the discussion. So please follow our work and stay tuned for our next webinar on May 27th, which will be focused on soil health. These webinars and Sustainable Conservation's collaborative program work are fueled by generous individual donations. So if you enjoyed the conversation, please consider supporting us by scanning the QR code that you see on your screen. Thank you again and have a great day, everyone.